Welcome. This video covers SAS libraries and SAS data. We have a reasonable idea now exactly what it means to be doing SAS programming. We have an idea about the syntax. We have an idea of the editor that we're going to use to actually write our programs. We're now ready to actually dive in and start learning how to code in SAS. And what we need to do first, if we're going to actually do some analyses on data, is figure out how to get that data in. And the first step to understanding how to get the data in is understanding exactly how SAS stores data itself. So that'll be what we do first. We're going to learn about SAS libraries, which we've mentioned a few times. These are folders somewhere that contain SAS data and SAS programs. We're going to learn exactly what we mean when we say something is a SAS data set versus, say, a raw data file. And then what we'll do after that is figure out how to read in external data. So we've seen this picture before. That is sort of describing the overall process or flow that we want to do. And we want to take raw data that's not in our program yet, bring it into SAS. So by the end of this module, we'll be able to do that. Again, the point of that is once we do that, we're able to then summarize it, analyze it, and communicate it pretty easily. Let's start with some lingo. We need to understand these terms that we're using so that we don't get confused. We keep using this term raw data. What do we mean exactly by raw data? We mean unprocessed data. So this is data that is not read into SAS yet. So you might have a data file that's an Excel file. So you might have something like mydata.xlsx sitting around. So a newer version of an Excel file. That would be raw data to us because we're trying to analyze it in SAS, and this is not a SAS data set yet. We have not read it into SAS, so we can't access it yet. We're going to stick to thinking about rectangular data. Of course, there are more complicated forms of data out there, but we're going to think about rectangular data sets that we can imagine as being a spreadsheet. And remember with this, each one of our rows are going to usually contain what we call an observation on some variables. So the columns are going to represent our variables or our fields of data. Again, to be able to analyze this, to be able to summarize it, to be able to use it to make data-driven decisions, we need to be able to get it into SAS first. So we need to take this raw data and make it into a SAS data set. What do we mean when we say a SAS data set? Well, we just mean a data set, a file on your computer or on a folder in a folder somewhere that has a file extension of .sas7bdat. So just like we saw that mydata.xlsx, the .xlsx, that is the file extension. That's helping your computer understand what kind of file this is and what programs to open it in. You're also going to see things like a .csv file, .text file, and you've probably seen something like a .exe file for an executable. So we're going to be reading in raw data from things of these first three forms and trying to get them into a file that would have an extension of .sas7bdat. Now, when we read our raw data into SAS, SAS is going to always store its data as a rectangular data set. The columns in that rectangular data set are going to be either character or numeric. So if the values are numbers, the variable would be numeric. If another variable has strings in it, so something like cat, dog, anything like that, that would be a character variable. Remember that once we've read our data in and we have it in a SAS data set, we can use proc contents to understand how it is actually stored. So again, once our data is in this format, we can use proc contents to understand exactly how it is stored. So we saw this very important table, a similar one to this in the previous lecture. And again, this tells us which variables we have in our data set, how they are stored, and then there are two other important things here that you're going to come across and it's important to know about. There are things called formats on variables. So formats change the way that variables are displayed. So for instance, you might have a variable that has 10 decimal points after it. Might be very ugly to look at. And so you can put a format on that that will round it to the nearest decimal or something like that. Nearest tenths place, for instance. And then there are things called labels. So labels are just more descriptive versions of variable names. And so when you print something out, oftentimes you want to see the label rather than the actual variable name itself because the label is a bit more descriptive. So again, proc contents is out there to help us understand, once we have a SAS dataset, how do I know more about it? How do I know how it's stored and what metadata there is about it? When you read in your SAS data, it's going to be stored in a SAS library. And remember, the whole goal here is to read in this raw data, either using a proc or a data step, and create a SAS dataset. So these SAS datasets, again, get placed into a library. What is a library? Well, it's just a folder that exists somewhere on your computer. And that folder is going to contain SAS datasets and SAS programs. So for instance, in this visual, there are two datasets that are SAS datasets, right? They have a .sas7bdat extension. And then there is a SAS program in there that might analyze those datasets. So again, a library is just a folder somewhere that has SAS data and SAS programs in it. The key here is just being able to tell SAS how to identify where a folder is. So we really need to tell SAS how to connect to that folder. That is, how do we tell SAS to make this folder a SAS library? And these SAS libraries can come in two forms. They can be a temporary library or a permanent library. Those mean exactly what you think. A temporary library is going to sort of erase everything in it whenever you're done with it, whereas a permanent library will keep the data and things in it, but you might have to tell SAS how to connect to it the next time you open up SAS. So let's first talk about permanent libraries and exactly what we mean there. So if we want to store SAS datasets permanently, that is, we want to keep the .sas7bdat file for later use, we need to save it into a permanent library. And there are a lot of different permanent libraries that come sort of built into SAS. So all of these are, except WebWork, so those ones are all permanent libraries that exist, and they correspond to a folder somewhere. When you're using SAS On Demand, it's a folder in the cloud somewhere. So again, the datasets within here are going to be kept whenever you close your SAS session. And how we reference these datasets is through what we call a two-level name. So the first thing is the library, followed by a period, and then the dataset within that library that we want to access. We've already seen how to do this a little bit. So there's the SAS help library that has different SAS help datasets. And if you wanted the cars dataset from there, you would do sashelp.cars. You might do sashelp.baseball if you want to access the baseball dataset, and maps.asia to access the Asia dataset within the maps library. Again, every one of these files is a SAS dataset, so a .sas7bdat file. Now on the flip side, we can have temporary libraries, and this is where you will still create a SAS dataset, but when you close down SAS, you're going to lose those SAS datasets. They're going to be deleted. And there's a temporary library that you're going to use a lot, and that's called the work library or working library. That's available down here at the bottom. And this is an automatically created library whenever you start up SAS. And again, when you close SAS, it's going to delete everything within that library. But what's kind of nice about using the working library is that you can access your dataset names using a one-level name. So by default, essentially, if you use a one-level name where you just say the dataset name, SAS is going to assume you're working in the work library. So let's look at an example of using the temporary library and actually creating a dataset to go in there. So a very common procedure that we're going to use to reorder the rows of our dataset or reorder the observations is proc sort. This is very useful whenever you want to view your dataset in a different way or do what's called by group processing. So you can often do a proc sort and a proc print to print out your dataset with certain observations coming first. And again, if you're doing what's called by group processing, there you would sort your data and then say find the summary statistics by every group of a certain variable. We'll cover that a little bit later. So let's look at proc sort and an example step of that. So proc sort step begins with the proc sort statement, just like every other proc step. And then we have a data equal option that tells us which data set we want to be using. And notice that this is a two-level name. So we give the library, period, and then the data set within that library. So this is saying sort the data set called stocks from the SAS help library. Then there's an out equal option, which you don't have to use, but in this case you would need to. And this is going to tell you tell SAS where to store the sorted data set. And so we're going to use a one-level name here. And since we're using a one-level name, notice that there's no something dot period there. Since we're using a one-level name, SAS will put that into our work library. And that might be the case because we don't really want to keep this sorted data set for later. We just maybe want to print it out now and look at it. So that makes up our proc sort statement. After that, you need to tell SAS which variable you want to actually do the sorting by. And so we use a by statement to do that. One of the variables from the stocks data set is called high. So we're going to sort by the high variable. We're going to end the proc sort step with a run statement. After that, what we can do is print out the sorted data set. So we can use proc print, and we just need to specify the sorted data set to print out. So again, a proc print step starts with a proc print statement. The main thing that you're going to want to put here would be the data equal option, which specifies which data set you want. And then, again, we're using a one-level name, so this is looking in the work library. And then we're going to end that with a run statement. So we have two steps here to sort the data and then print it out. If we run that code, both of those two steps, if you then look at your libraries panel over on your left, you will now see a data set sorted stocks down in your work library. And then if you go look at the actual data, you can see that these observations are reordered. And so you can see that they are sorted by the high variable here. Okay, so again, the process, what's going on behind the scenes here is we are creating a new SAS sorted stocks.sas7bdat file. So we're creating a new SAS data set that's being put into the work library. And since it's going in the work library, when we close down SAS, we're going to lose that data set. Again, if we want to keep this for later use, we would want to put this into a permanent library. And we've already seen some of these created permanent libraries that come built in, like the SAS help library. But we can, of course, create our own. And remember, a library is just a folder somewhere. So what we need to do is create a folder that we then have access to, that we can write to, that we can use as a folder. We're not going to be able to write to the SAS help the SAS help library. And we're not going to be able to write to the shared folder here as well, because that's something that I have on my end. So you're not going to be able to use either of those and write data sets to them. So what you need to do is create a folder on the cloud that you then will tell SAS, I want to use this as a library, and you'll be able to put your data sets there. Again, the key with a permanent library is that you do not lose those files, those SAS data sets, when you close SAS. But one drawback is that most of the time you have to reference data sets in a permanent library using a two-level name. Okay, so let's go through the process of creating our own folder and then telling SAS that we want to use that folder as a permanent library. First thing to do is to create your own folder on SAS On Demand for Academics. So you'll go over there to the Server Files and Folders area, and you can click on the Files Home area. And then you can use the menu to create a new folder. So you go up there to this menu, you click on Folder and create a folder. In this case, we'll call it MyLib, and then you'll be able to actually write to this particular folder. So you'll be able to put new data sets in there, whereas you can't do that to the other folders that we've looked at. So steps to creating our permanent library, we're creating a new folder. Now we just need to link that folder to a library name in SAS so that SAS knows we want to use this as a library. So if we go to the libraries section over there on the left, you will see all the libraries that we have seen before. But you can create a new one by clicking on this button over here. And when you do that, it's going to say, oh, you want to create a new library. You need to give that library a name. So in this case, I'm calling my library NCSU. And then you need to tell it where the folder is that you want to associate with the name NCSU. So again, we just created this MyLib folder. And so what we want to do is give it the full path to that folder, the full path on SAS On Demand. And you can figure out this folder path by clicking on Browse and getting to that folder. That's the easiest way to do it. You can also right click on the folder and go to Properties, and you'll see the path to it as well. Now I don't recommend this. So I don't recommend recreating this library every time on startup, because you want your SAS program to be entirely self-contained. So if you took it to another computer, you want it to work there. If you send it to somebody else to use, you want that to work as well. So I do not recommend making this automatic, because again, that's going to be something that's no longer in your code, and you're not going to be able to run your program from start to finish somewhere else. But if you run this, or you click OK on this, it's going to actually create some code. We'll look at that code in just a second. And it's going to run it and create a new library, in this case called NCSU. Yes. Now again, we want to make things reproducible. So rather than automatically doing this or using the menu-based method, we want to use code. And here's the code that would create this library. Your value for this U58 whatever, this is going to be different for you than it is for me. But this is one of the few standalone statements that we're going to look at in SAS. Again, most of the time our SAS programs run in what are called SAS steps. This is a standalone statement that you can run and it will do something for you. So this is called a libname statement. One thing it does is create a library. So the first thing you give it is the library name that you want to use. And this needs to be 8 digits or 8 characters or less. And then you give it the path to the folder that you want SAS to associate with that library name. And that's it. If you run that, you will then have a library that you've created. All right, so let's jump into SAS. Let's create our own permanent library. We'll use the snippet functionality so that we don't need to type that out every time, because we're not going to remember that U number, but we still want to have it programmatically done. So we're going to look at the snippet functionality to save that libname statement and be able to use it again and again. And then we'll look at this idea of temporary and permanent libraries and how to access some data sets from each of those. We'll also look at a .sas7bdat file that we already have and how SAS deals with those. All right, so here we are in SAS. We are now ready to create our program. So we'll need to create a new program. And again, you should have a header at the top. I'll go ahead and open my previous one, copy that header. And I'm going to change this to SAS Libraries program. And what we want to do first is set up our library. So again, the first thing to do would be to create this folder. I've already done it. So now I just want to tell SAS that this is going to be referenced as some library. If I go down to my libraries right now, I do not have access to any of the data that's in that folder. So these are all built-in data libraries that don't correspond to that folder. So what I need to do is tell SAS that I want to use this folder as my library. So again, I can right-click on this and go to Properties, and I can see the location of this folder for SAS On Demand for Academics. So I can copy that, and we prefer to use libname statements rather than the menu-driven method. So I'm going to say libname to set up a library. I'm going to call it NCSU. I'm going to use a quote and put that path in the quote. I can use a single quote or a double quote on that. Doesn't matter as long as I'm consistent. And then a semicolon to end that statement. If I run this, it should set up a library for me. So I run it. It says NCSU was successfully assigned. So that's great. If I go over here to my libraries, I now have an NCSU library. I already have some things in there that you wouldn't have. So now you can see that I already have a bunch of SAS data that exists. And so this is great. This tells us how SAS deals with things that are already .sas7bdat files. So census.sas7bdat is already a SAS dataset, which means it's been read in, it's been processed by SAS, and it's been saved in that format. So now when I go to my library, I already have access to that census data. I don't have to do any processing to get it in. It's not raw data anymore. It's a SAS dataset. Okay, great. The next thing we want to do is look at the snippet functionality to make sure that we don't have to figure out what this U business is every time that we run this. So what we can do is go over here to snippets, and you can look at my snippets and you can create a new one. So just like we created a folder, you can create a new snippet. And here you're just going to put this chunk of code in there. And then you can save this as libname or something like that. So I'll save it as libname snippet and hit save. So now if I open up a new program and I don't want to type in that same libname statement, I can go over here to my snippets and I can just drag it and drop it in there. This keeps it as being programmatic, but allows me to skip having to type it every time that I want to do it. So that's great. All right, the only other thing that we want to do is really just play around a little bit with temporary data sets and permanent data sets, looking at the 1 and 2 level names. So I'm going to create a temporary data set. To do so, I'm going to use a data step, which we haven't looked at how to do this quite yet, but I'm going to use a data statement to start a data step. And the first thing you do with the data statement is define the data set that you're going to be using. So I'm going to create a data set called temporary, if I can spell, data temporary, and I'm going to use a set statement, which we'll study later, to copy an existing SAS data set. So I'm going to copy ncsu dot, so this is my personal library that already has a few files. And actually, let's use SAS help so that you can make sure you can do this on your computer. So I'll do SAS help. Let's go with the baseball data set. So I'm going to copy that and hit run. So let's run that. And, oops, sorry, I hit save. Get it together. Here we go. So I now have an outputted data set. I check my log, make sure I don't see anything bad. No blue, or only blue, no red or green. So I go back over here. I created a data set using a 1-level name. So this should now exist in my working library. So I go over here to my libraries, I check out my work library, and I see that data set is created. Now again, this copy of this data set will be erased when I close down SAS. We've already seen examples of using the 2-level names. Let's just do one more. So I could do, let's do another plot. Proc sgplot data equals sashelp.baseball. Again, this is using a 2-level name saying from the SAS help library, look at the baseball data set, and let's just create a histogram. And now I need to give it a variable. So I go into SAS help, I look at baseball, I can see the different variables. Ones that are 1, 2, 3 are stored as numeric. Ones that are this triangle with an A, that's stored as character. So you'd create a histogram on numeric variables. So maybe I'll do a histogram of career at-bats. Again, SAS is not case sensitive, so I can do it that way. And then I'll run that code. And I get a nice histogram. Again, we'll study plotting and things like that in the future. So this gives me a very basic program that creates a library, deals with 1 and 2 level names. I'll go ahead and save that. Okay, so we are now sort of starting to learn how to actually deal with data in SAS and how to program it. So we have raw data and SAS data. We should know the differences between those. And then we have libraries where we store our SAS data, and we should know the difference between a temporary and working or a permanent library, as well as how to access data from each of those.